Okay, today we are in Luke 23 and the crucifixion. By this time now, as Luke is recounting what happened, Jesus is on the cross. And when you read Luke 23 at this time, you realize that Luke's focus is more on the people who are around the cross than it is on Jesus himself. There's several things that Jesus said on the cross. Luke doesn't mention, he mentions a few of them, but not all of them. But Luke focuses on those who were around him. So we're going to take a look today at the people who were there at the time, during the crucifixion, and what their responses were and how they reacted and so on. And what we're going to see is one of the most remarkable, I don't know how to say it, just one of the most unbelievable, remarkable things that's ever happened on this planet. It occurs while Jesus is on the cross. But we'll start with, so it starts in chapter 23 and down around verse 35. In verse 34, Jesus says, "Forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And the Roman soldiers had no idea what they were doing. They were just doing what they were commanded to do. And they parted his raiment, cast lots, and we'll come back to that. And the people, verse 35, and the people stood around, beholding. People stood beholding. Now, if you think about this, public executions in that day were common. I don't know if we've had them in this country. It's certainly not in any of our lifetimes have we had public executions, but they have been common in the past. And if you read about accounts, not necessarily in Jerusalem in the first century, when you read about accounts of public executions, like in England and so on, they attracted huge crowds sometimes. And the crowd would often interact with the people that were being condemned. Sometimes they would make fun of them, and they would insult them and so on. And in a few cases, they were sympathetic with those who were being executed and so on. But it was not uncommon for a public execution to attract a big crowd of onlookers, some of whom probably had no idea what was going on. In this case, they just were there because, well, it was a spectacle, and it attracted a crowd. And so here are these three men hanging on crosses at the place where the Romans typically executed people, and of course a crowd of people gathered. And so there were people just standing around watching. And the rulers, this is verse 35 again, the rulers, now that of course would have been the chief priests and so on, who were responsible as human agents for this occurring. Also with them derided him, mocked him, made fun of him. And that's not, if you read about public execution, that was a pretty common thing. But they're mocking him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself. If he be Messiah, the chosen of God." So, they were glorying in what they had accomplished. In their minds, this man was a false Messiah, and they finally had gotten rid of him. He was dying. They'd finally dealt with the fact that he challenged their authority. He challenged their power. He even challenged their monetary gain when he cleaned out the temple from the people that sold animals and changed money and so on. So he challenged them at a number of levels, and here they were, the empire strikes back. Here they were, the elite win. Here they were, we've done it. We've accomplished what we set out to accomplish. We've gotten rid of this guy, which was such a pain in our necks. And of course, in so doing, we've saved the people from this false Messiah that they were so willing to follow. And so they're making fun of him. If you're the Messiah, what are you doing up there? Show us, prove it, come down. Of course, remember now, this is important to realize that none of the Jews thought the Messiah was supposed to die. That was not part of what they'd been taught. That was not part of what they knew. So the fact that this man's on a cross dying verified their belief, their understanding that he was not the Messiah, that he was a false Messiah. And of course, they're throwing that back in his face. And they're making fun of him as he's dying, which to us seems just sort of cruel, and adding insult to injuries, as it were. But nonetheless, that was probably fairly common practice at public executions. I don't know what happened in Roman days, but if you read accounts of public executions after that, later than that, you see that was a common thing people did. And then in verse 36, the soldiers also mocked him. And of course, in verse 34, they split up his garments and they were gambling over. Now remember, now think about these soldiers. There were probably a quaternion, which is 16 soldiers under the command of a centurion, who were the execution detail. These are Roman soldiers, highly trained, highly disciplined. I mean, the Roman army and the Roman soldiers were the best army in the world at the time. And in fact, military historians say that the Roman army at the time that the Bible was written was extremely powerful, well-equipped, well-organized, well-ordered, had good officers and so on army. In fact, they say that it was not until the advent of gunpowder that an army came along in any other country that probably could have defeated the Roman legions. They were at the pinnacle of their power. These were very, very well-trained soldiers. And they're very well armed, and they knew how to, they had done this before. This is their assignment. Now these soldiers, if you think about it, have been ordered to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was probably a Roman soldier's nightmare, if you think about it. There might have been worse places to be stationed, but that must have been one of the worst. I mean, think about what we know from what the Bible tells us, let alone history. We know that the Jews hated the Romans. They considered the Romans to be oppressors. At the time this was written, the time this occurred, Rome occupied vast stretches of territory. In most places, they were more or less welcomed. There were some places where they were, but the Jews were way off of the scale in terms of hatred of the Romans. But it was more than that. Remember, what did the Jews at the time call Gentiles? Dogs. That's recorded in the Bible. They thought of Gentiles as being somewhat less than some subhuman. They thought that the Jews thought they were better than the Gentiles. They thought they were better than the Romans. Now imagine if you're a Roman soldier serving the most powerful army in the world and you've conquered a huge amount of territory and you've controlled it for years and years, and here's this group of people that have nothing. They don't even have an army, but they think they're better than you are. And they don't just think that they're holier than thou. Remember, the Jewish leaders wouldn't even go into Pilate's courtroom at the time they wanted Jesus crucified. They wouldn't go in. Why not? Well, you know why. For a Jew to go into a Gentile's house or to associate with a Gentile contaminated the Jew. It made him or her unclean. Again, you have the example of the Jesus story of the Good Samaritan. It's an example of that. We have other examples of that. The same thing happened that's why the chief priest wouldn't go into Pilate's courtroom, because it would have contaminated them. So here you've got these Roman soldiers living in Jerusalem, and the people that live there, that live among them, don't want anything to do with them. Not just because they're Romans and they don't like the fact that they're being occupied by an army, but because they're Gentiles, which means that they are substandard humans. And not only that, but any kind of association with these people contaminates you. You can't go into, remember what happened when Peter went to Cornelius' house? It was also a Roman centurion, remember that? And he came back to Jerusalem. What did they say? What happened? He was attacked because he'd gone to a Gentile's house and he'd eaten with a Gentile and he had to defend himself amid the attack. And these are Jewish Christians. These are not the Jewish leaders or the Jewish people. So you're stationed in this city. They got all these weird customs and weird ideas. They don't have the typical Jewish or Roman Greek, pantheon of all these gods and goddesses and all these festivals associated. They don't have any of that. It's very austere, at least according to what they were used to, what the Romans would have been used to. They didn't accept Roman or Greek culture. Most of the rest of the world did. It would have been a terrible place to be stationed. And then these people thought that they were holier, that they were just better than you. After all, the Jews, we're God's chosen people. God chose us out of all the nations of the earth. We are special. We are better than all these other nations because God chose us and God gave us all these blessings. And so you're dealing with a group of people that, first of all, don't want an army there, and second of all, are convinced that they are intrinsically superior to you, even though there's nothing physically to warrant that. And you're among these people, and here's this guy who's got a placard above his cross as he's dying. It says, the King of the Jews. Well, you talk about making him a target to these Roman soldiers. This man's a king? Yeah, this is a Jewish king, all right. Look, he's dying. And here's his garments, and we're gambling, we're making fun of this guy because he's a king? Come on, you got to be kidding me. I serve the emperor. I serve the emperor. The emperor rules, and here's this guy that claims to be a king. As you can see the whole thing. And so they're taunting him, making fun of him. The whole thing. They're enjoying themselves at this man's expense. They'd already done that because we'd read about how they abused him and beat him and put a crown of thorns on his head, and so I'm making fun of him the whole time because they're being told he's a king. Well, this is your king, Jews. What a wonderful example of royal authority this man is, that kind of thing. So they're mocking him and doing whatever. And they're also saying in verse 37, if thou be king of the Jews, then save yourself. I mean, who's in charge here, buddy? You king of the Jews or us, the Romans? So that, but again, this is standard. This is just their job. Who knows how many executions they've been involved in. Their training was harsh and brutal. The Roman army was not known for its sympathy, not known for its empathy, not known for its graciousness. And they were trained that way. So they're just doing their job. And in verse 38, there's an inscription over his cross written in 3 languages, so anybody in the neighborhood could read it, Greek, Latin, and even Hebrew. This is the King of the Jews. So you've got the rulers who are taunting him because they've won. They've put this guy in his place, finally. They've captured him, he's dying, and they're taking full advantage of that. You've got the Roman soldiers who don't have any clue what's going on. They probably have no idea who Jesus is or what he's done. They probably live fairly isolated lives because they were not at all welcome in Jewish society at all. And so here's this man, though he's got this sign over the top that they can read because it's in Latin and it says King of the Jews. And so, hey, this is your king. Great, we'll have some fun with this guy. And so they were. Now we come to verse 39, where it talks about the 2 criminals that were executed along with him. And one of the malefactors, which were hanged, railed on him, saying, if thou be the Christ, save thyself and us. He's echoing what he's hearing from the soldiers, from the Jewish rulers. And of course, he's in a desperate situation. He knows he's going to die. And he knows that his death is going to be long and painful. He knows it's very likely to take days. He's going to be there all day and all night and all the next day. And finally, he will escape the pain. Death will come and mercifully release him from the pain he's enduring. And he takes up the cry. If you're the Christ, if you really are the Messiah, save us. It's the only hope the man has. But he is making fun of him too. Railed on him. And then we come to this next guy. Verse 40. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, dost thou not fear God? Now, these are probably Jewish criminals. Seeing thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. Now, I don't know what they'd done. Whatever they'd done, they knew when they did it, it was a capital crime, and they knew that if they were caught, they were going to be punished by crucifixion. And so this man says, we're here because we deserve to be here. Whatever we did, it was such that we deserved to die. But this man, he hasn't done anything wrong. He's not a criminal. He hasn't been. Now, I don't know what this criminal knew about Jesus. He may have heard about him. He may have seen him. He may have seen him perform miracles. We have no idea what his knowledge of Jesus is or where it comes from. All we know is that he understands what he says to his compatriot. Maybe they were co-conspirators. I don't know. Because his compatriot's dying next to him and says, we're here because we deserve to be here. This man has no reason to be here. There's no physical human reason why this man's broken any law that would result in his death. And that tells you a couple things. It tells you, first of all, they were close enough they could talk to each other. They weren't exactly in real good physical condition. Jesus was probably by far the worst. He'd been beaten and tortured probably more than they had. But they were close enough to each other that even in the pain that they were suffering, they could communicate with each other. So they weren't separated very far. They probably didn't have a whole lot of energy. And then we have this amazing thing. Verse 42. And he, the criminal, said unto Jesus, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. Now notice in verse 43, Jesus takes that request seriously. He responds to the man's faith. Now think about this. Where in the world does this come from? How in the world would anybody in that situation with this bloody, beaten man who's dying, what in the world would possess anybody to think this man was going to come into a kingdom? He's crucified. He's not just tied to a cross with ropes. He's nailed to it. He's not just, he's been beaten. Is savagely beaten. He's got blood streaming down his face, or he did have, maybe it's dried up by now from that crown of thorns and so on. He's been just way above and beyond the normal way they treated criminals. What in the world is there in that scene that would lead anybody to think that this man on this cross is going to come into a kingdom? That's preposterous. He's dying. I don't know, where did this criminal get this idea from? Not only that, think about this. This criminal, this guy dying on the cross, was probably the only person on the whole planet that thought that Jesus was coming into a kingdom at that time. I'm sure the disciples and those who followed him thought maybe they were hoping that something would happen, that he would miraculously descend from the cross and establish his kingdom, but there was no evidence that was going to happen. In fact, the evidence all pointed in the exact opposite direction, which is exactly what happened. He died. Now look over, next page over in chapter 24. This is what the people that were the disciples, I mean the 11 and the women and others that were associated with Jesus, this is what they were thinking. In chapter 24, we have the story of Jesus going to joining the two that were traveling to Emmaus. And as you remember, they have a conversation. That's recorded for us starting, in about, 14, verse 13, I think. But I want to read to you verse 18. And one of them, though there's two men, Jesus joins them. They don't realize who he is. And one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answering said unto him, Art thou only a stranger in Jerusalem, and hast not known the things which are come to pass there in these days? Remember, this is after the resurrection, so it's a few days later. And this is, everybody knows by this time that Jesus was crucified. And that, again, as you know, the chief priests tried to do it real quickly and keep it a secret so there wouldn't be any kind of a revolt against them. And they succeeded in that. But by the time you get to the road to Emmaus, and Jesus joining them, this is well known. And he, Jesus, plays innocent, and said unto them, What things? And they said unto him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, which was a prophet, mighty indeed in word before God and all the people. And how the chief priest and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and have crucified him. But now notice, these are believing Jews. They're not among the 11. But we trusted that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel. Now the word trusted there is not the word faith. It's often translated hope. It's the verb form of a word that's almost always translated as a noun as hope. And what it means is we had hoped that he would deliver Israel, that we had hoped that he was the Messiah. Now, in this case, it's not the word hope that you would say, I hope I win the lottery, or I hope my rich uncle dies and leaves me $1 million. I don't even have a rich uncle that I know of. It's not that kind of a hope. This is a hope that has support. We hoped, we trusted that he was the Messiah. And it doesn't say this, but what's implied in that word is we really thought he might be, because he'd done all these vast miracles and his great teaching and all these things. So we really thought that he must be the Messiah, and we really hoped he was the Messiah, but he died. And so he can't be the Messiah. He's not. But we had hoped he was. That was what the people, the believers, the disciples, the women who were there, those who knew Jesus and believed him, that's what they were thinking. They were hoping that this was the Messiah, and their hopes were being crushed because their Messiah was a beaten, bloodied man on a cross dying in the full sun of the day. Now they go on and say, the people of Emmaus say in verse 21, and besides this, okay, so we hoped he was the Messiah. We had evidence. We thought he might be the Messiah. We were hoping that he was. But now this has happened, he said. Today is the third day since these things were done. Yea, and certain women also of our company made us astonished, which were early at the sepulchre, at the grave, and they found not his body, and so on and so forth. So they're saying, we hoped he was the Messiah, but he died. But now we don't know what to think. Because we have these people saying that they've seen him alive. I don't know if we can believe him or not. I mean, come on. What would you do if someone came to you and said, hey, so-and-so that died the other day? Well, I saw him. I was there. He talked to me. What would you do? Yeah, you'd call the guys in little white coats to come get him. So you certainly wouldn't buy it at face value. You'd want better evidence than that. And so at this point, these men are confused. They had hoped. like everybody else that knew Jesus, that he was the Messiah, but their hopes had been crushed because he died at the hands of the Romans in a horrible way. But this criminal, that's not what he's saying. He's not saying, if you happen to be the Messiah. That's not what he says. Let me read it to you again. Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. Why in the world would the man say that? Where would he possibly get that idea from? You see this. You see the miraculousness of this. This is the only person in the whole planet probably at that time, while Jesus is dying, that thought that Jesus was coming into a kingdom. There were some people while he was still alive who hoped that he might miraculously descend from the cross and so on. But once he died, that hope was shattered. He was not the Messiah. They were convinced of that because he had died. But this man who's dying himself next to this beaten, bloody, not quite corpse of a man who's just barely half alive, says to this guy, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Not if you come into your kingdom, but when you come into your kingdom. How in the world did the criminal get that? There's nothing in this scene that would even suggest that this dying Jesus is coming into a kingdom. But somehow the criminal is convinced that he is. Now, I don't know whether the criminal was thinking that there was going to be an earthly kingdom, or whether the criminal understood that there was a heavenly kingdom, the kingdom from within, like Jesus had talked about. I don't know what the criminal was referring to when he asked to come into the kingdom. If he understood it was a heavenly kingdom, he's the only person, with the possible exception of Simeon and Mary, Jesus' mother, who understood that. So this man dying on this cross has more faith than anybody else on the planet at the time that we know of. He truly believes. It's not just that he hopes, he believes that Jesus is coming into a kingdom, and he asked Jesus to let him join him. Where did it come from? Where did that knowledge come from? Where did that faith come from? Well, as you can see, there's only one place it could have come from. There's nothing in this scene that would lead one to any sort of confidence that this dying Jesus is going to come into a kingdom. It had to come from God himself. It had to. There's no earthly reason for it, no earthly evidence for it at all. That's true of every one of us. The faith that it takes to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Savior, that Jesus is, as we sang, our older brother. That faith comes only from the Holy Spirit. And for whatever reason, God chose this man on a cross to demonstrate that beyond doubt. The only way this man could have ever have had the faith to believe that the dying man next to him, that was in far worse shape than he was the Messiah, and coming into the kingdom was if God had revealed it to him. It's the only way. Again, I can't pray anyone into heaven, and I can't argue anyone into heaven, and I can't convince anyone that they should accept, believe, receive Jesus Christ. And there's nothing I can do, really. I can proclaim the gospel. Even more importantly, I can live the gospel. But what God does with that's up to him. This man's experience demonstrates probably as great as anything in the Bible, although there are many other examples. Paul is an example. For example, this man's experience demonstrates as well as much as anything in the Bible that it's all God's work. He may give us a role in it, and occasionally he does. But we can't bring anybody to salvation. We may give them information that's necessary for their salvation. But ultimately, it's God's Spirit that does that. And without God's Spirit, nothing's going to happen. That what we call the Great Commission. What's it say to do? Tell people, baptize them, make disciples. It doesn't say that somehow you're going to persuade them to be saved. Think about this. Jesus said, in the occasion when Jesus said, lo, the fields are white and ready to harvest. Remember that? Lo, the fields are white and ready to harvest. Talking about the field of humanity, ready for salvation. And then he tells his disciples what to do. What does he tell his disciples to do? Remember? I'm not reading it to you, but remember what he says? He doesn't say to them, go into those fields and start working. He doesn't say to them, go in there and reap that harvest. That's not what he says. What does he tell them to do? Pray that the Lord of the harvest will send forth reapers. He doesn't tell them to be the reapers. He says, you pray and ask God to send out the reapers. What does that tell us? That tells us if the reapers don't come from God, they're not really doing anything. The reapers of the souls that are ready for salvation come, the God sends people into their lives. And God may use those people to save them, to result in their salvation, but it's not my effort. If I think somehow I've got to work, redeem, save the world in our lifetime, or, present the gospel to every man, woman, and child on the planet, or whatever, that's not what Jesus told his disciples to do. He said, pray and ask God to send forth those reapers. And if God sends them forth, then they're going in God's power. Now, what did God do? Did God send forth reapers? Absolutely. We know a bunch of their names. Paul, Barnabas, Timothy, Peter, James, John, and probably a bunch of other people, Apollos, a bunch of people we never heard of. God sent forth reapers, and the harvest was reaped. But it wasn't reaped because of human effort. It was reaped because of the people that God sent. So God may or may not send us out into his world to reap the harvest. In this case, we have a clear example. God, the only way you can explain this man's faith in this dying Jesus is miraculous. It has to be the power of God, because there's nothing at all in this scene that would lead anybody to think that this dying man could come into a kingdom. But for some reason, because God revealed it to him, the thief thought that he was and asked to be a part of that. And Jesus took him seriously. This man was not, crying out for mercy because he was dying. He was sincere and somehow understood that Jesus really was coming into the kingdom, because in verse 43, Jesus said to him, verily, truly, I promise you, I say unto you, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. What's paradise? Well, that's a good question, because there's very little information about it in the Bible, but it more than likely just means the place where God dwells, what we would call heaven. Then verse 44. The centurion. And it was about the 6th hour. That's noon. And there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Now, people say, well, that was an eclipse. No, eclipses, you've seen solar eclipses. They don't last 3 hours. It's only, if you've ever been even in a total eclipse, it's only dark for a few minutes. And I don't know how dark it was. I don't know if it was pitch black night, or if it was just, darker than normal. And it says the earth. I don't know if it means the entire planet or just means the vicinity of Jerusalem. I don't know. But it was something supernatural. It was dark. And it says the sun was darkened. So it may have been like midnight. I don't know. And the veil of the temple was rent in the midst. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend thy spirit. And having said this, he gave up the ghost. Now you see what happens. He's crucified sometime around 9 a.m. Sometime between 9 and 12 is when all the things we've just read about occurred. People mocking him, people making fun of him, the thief on the cross, the soldiers, and so on. But then all of a sudden it gets dark. There's no explanation for that. I mean, what would you do if in a few minutes, when it's noon, about 12, 13 minutes from now, all of a sudden the sun went dark? How would you respond? And it stayed that way for hours. And you'd wonder, is it ever coming back? What's going on here? This was obviously a miraculous event that, as far as I know, is unprecedented in the planet. And so this takes it beyond just this man dying on a cross. Now something supernatural has happened that nobody can miss. I don't know how many people knew the veil of the temple had been torn. Probably only a few, because there are only a few people who could even get in there. But darkening the sun, everybody could see that. You couldn't help but not see unless you were blind. And so now all of a sudden there are these supernatural events that occur. The sun gets black. And then, after 3 hours of darkness, this man dies. But he doesn't die like a normal person. He doesn't just die because of the pain and finally gets to him. In fact, remember, crucifixions took a lot longer than 6 hours, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. to die. It could take days. But this man says, I commend unto you my spirit, and then he's gone. Again, which of us, who in the planet can do that? Who can say, okay, I'm dying now, bye-bye, and go? Nobody. Nobody. We don't have control over the time of our death. Oh yeah, you could, this person can commit suicide, but we don't have a control over the time of our death. And Jesus did. So here are these two miraculous events that are witnessed by those that are around him that must have given them all pause. The sky turning black in the middle of the day has got to be scary because you don't know why. We know a whole lot more about the celestial events than they did in that day, but still, we couldn't explain it. All of a sudden it goes black and there's why? And then you have this man who's dying and he goes and he does this thing that is just miraculous. So now you've got not just a dying man on a cross. Now you have a man dying on a cross accompanied by all these supernatural events that are beyond explanation. There's no human explanation for any of these things. Now, look at verse 47. Now when the centurion would have been the man who was in charge of the execution detail. And he would have been a Roman army officer. He wore a special helmet and so on, so he was easily distinguished as just like our officers wear different symbols on their shoulders and so on, but in the Roman days they wore a special helmet so you'd know he was a centurion. He'd been in the army for quite a while probably. It was probably a profession for him. This is probably by no means the first execution he'd witnessed. Goodness only knows how many he'd been a part of. He was there like the soldiers, not only to perform the manual efforts that needed to be done to crucify someone, but also to protect the situation. Again, the Romans would have been concerned that people would attack them and try to release the prisoners. That probably happened at times, so they would send at least 16 armed Roman soldiers in full regalia in order to discourage that kind of activity, and the centurion would have been in charge of them. So he'd done this before almost certainly, but he's never seen this. He's never seen a crucifixion where all of a sudden the sky goes black and stays that way. He's never seen a crucifixion where a man died of his own volition. He's seen people die because they eventually get tortured to the point that their bodies can't take it anymore and they die. But this man died of his own volition. He's never seen that, and he looks at this, and look what it says. And when the centurion, this is a Roman, probably a Latin Roman from Italy, soldier who probably knows very little about the Jewish tradition, has no background in the knowledge of God. You got to remember, at the time this was written, only people that had any knowledge of God to speak of were the Jews, and they totally tortured and polluted it. There was no such thing as a Christian family. They didn't exist. And so here's this guy, but what's he do? He says he glorified God. He saw what had happened and he realized this is not the normal. This is not just human. Something supernatural is happening here. And it says he glorified God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. That's all. I don't know what happened to that centurion. We don't know. That's all we know about him. We don't know his name. We don't know what he did. We don't know if this was a change, if this was a sea change in his life. We don't know if he became a follower of Christ. We don't know what happened, but we know that at the time of the death of Jesus Christ, he glorified God. He understood this is supernatural. This man somehow has triggered all of these supernatural events, which I've never seen before and can't possibly explain, and he glorifies God. Verse 48, all the people that came together to that sight, beholding things which were done, smote their breast and returned. They were equally stunned. I suspect they were shut up. They were silenced. These people who'd been making fun and mocking the whole time now has gotten beyond that. Something that they could not explain was happening. Something scary was happening. The sun had disappeared. That's frightening. Verse 49, the last group, and all his acquaintance, those who followed him, the 11, and others, like the men that walked to Emmaus 3 days later. And the women that followed from Galilee stood afar off beholding these things. They saw it. They weren't, with a few exceptions, there were a few that were. John, we know from other Gospels that John and Jesus' mother were at the foot of the cross. They were right there in front, which says an awful lot about Mary. would you really want to watch your son die like he was dying? They were there, but everybody else was afar. They stood off and watched it. They saw what was happening. And of course, if the sun went black, they had to have seen that. But as you know from later account, what happened later, their hopes, like the people on the road to Emmaus, their hopes were shattered. This man died. And even though his death was supernatural and accompanied by supernatural signs and miracles, he couldn't be the Messiah. Because the Messiah was not supposed to die. The Messiah was supposed to live forever. That's what they'd been taught. That's what they believed. That's what they were sure of. And now their world's shattered. Now, I won't get into it, but what do they do next? In spite of the fact that their hopes have been shattered, that their world has been turned upside down, what do, these women? They get his body from the cross and they bury it. Why? They didn't think he was the Messiah. They had hoped, like the men from Emmaus, they had hoped that he was, but they now no longer thought he was. Why did they bury him? Why did they go to such great trouble? They loved him. They loved him. They absolutely loved him. You know as well as I do that if you had a loved one that died, you would want to see their body buried properly. You'd want to see it taken care of. You'd want to see the customs that are associated with death in our culture to be followed. You wouldn't want their body to... What were the Romans going to do with these bodies? Were they going to take them to a cemetery and bury them and put a cross over top them or hit tombstone or something? No. Unless somebody claimed them, they were going to throw them into the garbage dump. What Jesus uses as an example of hell. They were going to throw them in the garbage dump, and they were going to, they weren't going to take care of them. They didn't care. These were criminals. They owed them nothing. They would be glad to get rid of them. So there would be some detail that would take these bodies off the cross and haul them to the garbage dump and toss them in with everything else that's in there. But the women loved him. They loved him. They loved him enough that they treated him, his dead, broken body, and it was broken, with respect and with honor, just as you would one of your loved ones. Well, we'll talk about that next week. But these people who saw this event, who were there at the time, give us a broad range of responses. The most amazing one, of course, is that criminal to whom God revealed that this man really was the Messiah and he really was coming into a kingdom. No, it does not fit the pattern you've been taught. And no, what's happening is not consistent with the way you've been taught the Messiah is going to behave, but nonetheless, he's coming into a kingdom and you need to join him. Well, we'll pick up the rest of this next week. Father, we thank you for all that you've done for us. We stand in awe of your Spirit and how he moves in us, and how for reasons known only to yourself, you loved us and brought us to you, and we are grateful for that. Help us, Father, that we would present our bodies as living sacrifices as you have instructed us, that we would be at your disposal to do with as you wish. We would be willing, obedient children. Keep us safe. Be with Faith, Tim, as they are in Florida ministering. Pray, Father, that you would give them fruit for their labors, if that be your will. Be with Sarah and Rich, bring them home safely. We thank you, Father, for this nation you've given us to live in, the freedoms that we enjoy. We would ask, Father, humbly, that if it be your will, you would preserve them for us, but that's in your hands. Again, Father, we thank you for what you are. We ask that you would help us to become more like you. In Jesus' name, amen.